Hey everybody, it's Michael Mann from Michael Mann Security Services. Questions about armed security teams. Should your church have an armed security team? And we're not here to tell you should or you shouldn't. I'm going to tell you from my experience from developing and implementing armed security teams in corporations, for churches, and for private Christian schools, what that looks like. So again, I'm not telling you yes or no. I'm just going to tell you some things that you need to think about prior to implementing that program. All right? So let's talk about it very, very quickly. Armed security teams. What are some things that you need to consider even before you go to the church and talk to them about it? Because they're going to probably ask you these questions anyway. So the very first thing is, before I implement an armed security team or we start to seriously discuss it, let's look at risk. What is risk? That is your church's exposure to a specific hazard. And when we talk about armed security teams, we're talking about two very specific elements or pieces of risk. Number one, what's the risk of an active shooter or some violent person coming to your church? And number two, what's the risk of having armed personnel there? So this bad person never shows up and you've got armed people on your team. What does that mean? So very specifically, negligent discharges. Somebody that wants to carry open carry, which I believe probably doesn't fit into the culture of most churches. So two types of risks that you need to talk about. Again, the risk of something bad happening, what that means, what that looks like. And number two, when you arm people up, what is the risk to the church? Whether that's a social risk, it's a safety risk, or it's a cultural risk for the church. Okay, I'm a really big proponent of covert arm programs where everyone's concealed and no one knows about the weapons. But again, that is your choice. It's your church. It's your facility. You guys at the security team, you know best to protect it or how to protect it. Second, the requirements. What are the legal requirements in your state to have a volunteer standing a post and being armed at your church? We're in Middle Tennessee, specifically Nashville or the Nashville area. Here, you just have to have a carry permit. So don't know what the requirements are in your state, but you want to go into your state's laws and figure out what that looks like to make sure that you're going to meet the state's requirements. You don't want the church violating the law. Number three, standards. Standards are different than requirements. So a requirement is something that you have to do based on law. Standard is an expectation that you're going to put into your team to make sure that they meet those standards. So what that means is, how long, what's the training look like outside of the state requirement? What are you going to do every year to make sure that they're still proficient with those firearms? What does that mean? And you need to write that down and stick to it. Just understand, if you make it too hard, you got to remember, these are volunteers. They're volunteering for service on top of everything else that they do for your church, on top of their families, and on top of their full-time jobs. So if you make the standards too tough, you may lose some folks, or some people may not want to be a part of it. So not saying make the standards slow, just some things for you guys to think about, and ladies. Number three, the selection of personnel. This is something that I see when I work with churches and with private Christian schools. So you don't want this to be a gun club, right? That's not what this is about. Armed security is about response. It's not about prevention. So this is something that you don't necessarily have to have. But when I go to select personnel, what does that mean? What does that look like? I don't want someone that just wants to carry a gun. I want someone that's willing to carry that gun to respond if it were necessary, because again, the primary responsibility of the security team is to prevent an event from happening or occurring, and the gun doesn't prevent anything. It's just a tool of response, folks. Insurance company. You need to notify the church's insurance company. If you are standing post armed now, or you have an armed security team and you haven't gone to the church to talk to them about insurance requirements, you need to go do that. There's a really good possibility that the insurance that's there now, if they haven't been notified, the company hasn't been notified, they do not cover the church if something were to happen, very specifically if a volunteer armed security team had to respond. Now they're going to ask some questions. If you haven't been through this before, there are some specific questions they're going to ask you. Because I've done this for large companies and churches and Christian schools, let me tell you some of the questions that they're going to ask. Number one, are these people being paid? They're going to be a little bit confused at first when you talk about volunteers, because a lot of insurance companies don't get the concept, because this is something that they normally do or cover, which means they might have to go to another carrier, some sort of a secondary carrier, to assist you with this. The next question they're going to ask is, how many people are armed? When we look at risk, We look at an insurance company, well, we're transferring the risk to that insurance company. So that's what insurance is for. That's our risk transfer. So they want to know how many people are armed, because the more people you have, the more risk is involved. So they're going to want to know how many people are going to be carrying guns. The third question that we run into, or that I've been asked from insurance companies, is what kind of training do they have to go to? Is there a state requirement? What standard do you have into place to make sure that this is going to be safe and effective? So they're going to want to know exactly what the training requirements are, what the frequency of that training is, and who has to go through that training. The next question they're going to ask is about procedures very specifically. I haven't worked with a church or a school yet where the insurance company did not ask for specific procedures. And those procedures are going to deal with the use of force, when they can use force, what kind of force they can use, and then very specifically outside of guns, what other weapons, like intermediate weapons, are they carrying, and have they gone through training and certification with those specific weapons or intermediate weapons. So those are some of the policies that there's a good chance they're going to ask you to write or create before they're going to cover you. And then the last element when we look at armed security programs is continuous improvement. And that goes back up to your standards, folks. What are you going to do every year? What are you going to do quarterly to make sure that your team is improving continuously? So we're always raising the bar to make sure that this program is both safe and effective. Again, remember, you do not have to have an armed security program to protect your church. Physical protection is about prevention, not response. The gun is a tool of response. Okay? If you don't know how to do this, again, we've got some stuff coming up soon. Check our Facebook page, Michael Mann Security Services. It's going to tell you all about it. Go to the website, michaelmannsecurityservices.com. We've got some articles about this that are free, and they can tell you all about this also. And remember, it's about prevention, not response.